you again, Cheryl and Irene, and everyone who's contributing to the service. And thank you to Reverend Jason for inviting me to be with you this Sunday. About 3 years ago, I realized that I had spent over 10 years as a professional listener, as listening constitutes one of my primary activities as a chaplain, and that it was about time for me to listen to myself. This is the first dimension of listening I'd like to explore, how to listen to our inner selves. Although I had always maintained strong self-care and support practices, I found that years of witnessing loss and grief, as well as the trauma of the pandemic, had built layer upon layer of a deep soul exhaustion. So after much deliberation and discernment, and loving support from friends and colleagues, I took a leave of absence from work for burnout. I took time to pause, to grieve, to reflect. I went to some beautiful places in nature to just be present and to keep quiet. I spent time alone, journaling and meditating, and I spent time with others, talking with my support circle and receiving other people's deep and generous listening. After about 3 months, I felt ready to return to work, but with a different perspective, and I returned renewed. That time away helped me to find out who I was without work, efficiency, accomplishment, or business. I decided to give more time to my life outside the hospital through walking my dog, taking music lessons, and starting a ceramics hobby. After everything, I've come to believe that we might all go through such a period, or maybe more than one period, when we need to really retreat in order to listen to the deep truths of our lives, and that important revelations come from that kind of listening. Our UU saint, Mary Oliver, uses the injunction listen quite frequently in her poetry. She writes, "Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it life?" And in her poem Mindful, she states, "Every day I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight. It is what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over in joy." In my period of reflection, when I listened internally, I felt that I too had been breathing shallowly, and that I was often missing that part of life that instructs us in joy and delight. So I wonder if you need to really listen to yourself, and what you might need to listen to in this present moment. And if there are any barriers to listening to ourselves, how can we move past those barriers in order to connect to our truest voice? According to science, the quietest room on Earth is the anechoic chamber at Orfield Labs in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Anechoic means no echoes. Has anyone been there or been to a similar room? One person. Excellent. I'd love to hear about it. The room's background noise is measured in negative decibels at a negative 9.4 decibels, whereas a typical quiet bedroom measures around 30 decibels. Visitors to this room report hearing the sound of blood pumping in their veins, or even the sound of their eyelids shutting when blinking. The lab's founder, Stephen Orfield, says, "When it's quiet, ears will adapt. The quieter the room, the more things you hear. You'll hear your heart beating. Sometimes you can hear your lungs or hear your stomach gurgling loudly. In the anechoic chamber, you become the sound." I believe that we can put ourselves in the spirit of deep listening without paying hundreds of dollars to visit an anechoic chamber. Maybe it's sitting on a mountain or at the beach or at home in front of a candle, or in this space on Sunday morning. When we did the meditation earlier, could you hear your own heartbeat? Could you start to hear sounds that maybe previously you had ignored? Are there any other places in your life where you can hear your blood pumping or your eyelids blinking? Do you have a regular practice of giving yourself that time and quiet that allows you to hear your own soul stirring, or to hear the voice of the divine calling your name? Do you have something deep inside that needs to be heard? I hope that all of us will have time in the next week to listen to that inner voice. But we also think of listening as involving two parties. Many years ago, I was living in West LA, and I lived with a roommate, my close friend. I was studying to be a chaplain at UCLA, and at the same time, she was in medical school to become a doctor. One day, my friend asked if she could listen to my heart. I, as a chaplain, was so excited because I thought this meant having a deep heart-to-heart share with my friend. You can tell she meant something different. She had just gotten her very first stethoscope, so she really wanted to literally practice listening to my heartbeat. And despite this early realization that listening to a heart can mean so many different things in healthcare, I do feel I have the privilege of working alongside some of the very best listeners. As a community minister, my role is to serve the community outside of our UU congregations. And so I do that as a chaplain at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, and I work on a palliative care team. So that is an interdisciplinary, very collaborative group of people, including doctors, nurses, social workers, pharmacists, and a chaplain. And we take care of people who have serious illnesses. So every day I feel that I'm really learning from my colleagues, but also from our patients and their family members, what deep listening means. I see listening as a bridge to compassion. The angry, defiant, shouting patient, or that person who is anxiously bombarding you with questions, or the person so demoralized they cannot get up from bed, they often find peace with a good listening session. Not only can the act of being listened to create space for self-compassion and kindness, listening creates compassion for others. I can't count the number of times a patient might have told me that they are okay, but I should really check on their neighbor next door, who they can hear through the walls. Or have a patient tell me the very best thing someone did, whether it was a doctor or a nurse, or maybe a member of the environmental services team or the food services team. The best thing they did was sit down and listen. Although it can be very hard to be a good listener in the hospital, it is also an incredible place to practice listening. Interpersonal listening contains that potential for compassion and transformation, and it can be deeply challenging, especially when we think that someone has drastically different beliefs or values than we do. The tendency to shut down or become defensive or become so caught in our own plan of what we're going to say next to argue our point limits our ability to be good listeners. This happened to me while I was meeting with a new patient. He held really deep beliefs about integrative medicine and spirituality, and he welcomed a visit from the chaplain. However, halfway through talking about his life, he started to talk about his experience of the pandemic. Somehow he got on the topic of the vaccine. He said the vaccine did more harm than good, and in fact, he believed the vaccine had killed more people than COVID. Instantly, I started to think of the grief and sadness of watching countless patients die of COVID, and the joy and relief that I felt along with my colleagues when we received a vaccine that could protect ourselves and our vulnerable patients. I could feel myself getting tense and wanting to edge towards the door, preparing a million counter-arguments. I wasn't really sure what I could say without exploding in anger, and yet I said the most generous statement I could think of, which was, "It sounds like you really care about fairness and people." Miraculously, that theme of fairness led the patient to share more deeply about his own health, that he had just received a cancer diagnosis at the age of 40, after living a very healthy physical life of being active, being a vegan, being a good person. Eventually, he exclaimed, "It's not fair. Why is this happening to me?" One of the most normal and profoundly painful existential questions that many people ask every day in the hospital. Sticking with listening, trying to be open, had allowed me to be a compassionate and supportive witness to his spiritual pain. And I couldn't have done that if I had left the room immediately when he started talking about COVID. In the poem I read in the chalice lighting, John Fox writes, "When someone deeply listens to you, it's like holding out a dented cup you've had since childhood and watching it fill up with cold, fresh water." Is there a place in your life where you feel called to listen to another person more deeply? Or is there a way to express gratitude to a person who has listened to you and given you that gift of deep understanding? These acts of person-to-person listening are even more valuable because listening in our world feels like a lost art. When we turn on the news, it's full of violence and conflict and of people making statements for shock value and offense. It becomes a vicious cycle that we also participate in a lack of listening with our own short attention spans. Personally, I recognize that my own ears are full of podcasts, which I play on 1.5 speed. I don't know if anyone else does that. You can listen to more. And my attention is often drawn to the social media algorithms, to different memes, not what I truly want to listen to. Too frequently, we read or listen to just the headlines and not to longer conversations that have the depth and nuance our world and its many issues require. And in just the last few months, we've had many examples of a profound political lack of listening, such as so-called peace talks, in which both parties do not seem to be really communicating. Are there any examples of deep listening that you are witnessing in the world? I hope someone or some organization came to mind. Maybe neighbors reaching out to help neighbors. Maybe a news story about a perspective that you haven't heard much of and need to. Maybe there was a time in your own week when you felt inspired to take a pause and delve more deeply into understanding a person, a nation, or a part of the world. The question of how we become better listeners in a world that often rewards distraction and resists listening is an important one. In her book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, Jenny Odell invites us to reclaim our attention. She encourages us to resist the constant barrage of noise that we have access to on our phones and to step away from the hamster wheel of constant consumption and production. It's a book very similar to the story of the garden of Frog and Toad. How can we practice doing a little bit less shouting, and practice waiting for our seeds to just grow? Jenny Odell writes, "To do nothing is to hold yourself still so that you can perceive what is actually there." What would it look like for us to hold ourselves still? And what might we finally perceive with that gift of attention? How might our relationships to others and the world change with that gift of listening? I do not want to diminish the fear or overwhelm we might experience when we look at the world or what's happening in our country, or to suggest that listening alone is a solution to everything. But perhaps it's a beginning. And maybe that practice begins right here. Maybe congregations are one of the few places left where we intentionally gather, not to win arguments, not to perform, not to consume, but to listen to ourselves, to one another, and to something larger than ourselves. In the midst of the world's suffering and in our collective work towards liberation and love, we can commit ourselves to listen to activists and change makers, to builders and dreamers and poets, not in sound bites and not in tweets, but stories that tell the fullness and the humanity, the suffering and tender hope of it all. When we slow down enough to listen to ourselves, we can connect with renewal and energy and peace so that we can really bring our full selves to the work of listening to the world. And when we listen deeply to other people, we create connections that draw us closer in beloved community. So I urge you, friends and members of Tapestry Church, to listen. The world we dream about, a world with love at the center, is a world that listens. A world where we all listen and where we all are listened to. May it be so.